The gunshot that killed her husband echoed through the canyon long after Thomas Owen's body hit the ground, and Tessa Owen stood at the edge of Trail's End with one hand pressed against her swollen belly, wondering how she would survive the next 5 months alone. The small settlement perched on the western edge of Dodge City, Kansas, barely qualified as a town in 1876, just a handful of rough structures clinging to the dusty earth where the wagon trail disappeared into wilderness, and now she had nowhere else to go. Her husband had been guiding a supply wagon when bandits ambushed the route 3 days prior, leaving her with nothing but his few possessions and the baby growing inside her. The other women in the settlement whispered when she passed, their eyes full of pity and judgment in equal measure. A pregnant widow at 22 years old, no family within 1,000 miles, no money to speak of, and winter approaching with the relentless certainty of the Kansas plains. Tessa stood outside the boarding house where she had rented a small room with the last of their savings, watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. "You should eat something." Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, appeared beside her with a shawl draped over her substantial frame. "Baby needs nourishment, even if you do not feel much like having it yourself." "I know." Tessa's voice sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "I will in a moment. There was a man asking about you today." Mrs. Henderson's tone carried a note of curiosity. "Big fellow, mountain man by the looks of him. Said he knew Thomas from some years back. Wanted to know if the widow needed anything." Tessa's heart constricted. She had heard the stories about men who preyed on vulnerable women in these frontier towns, offering help that came with unspoken prices. "I do not know any mountain men." "Did not think you did. I sent him on his way, told him you were managing fine." Mrs. Henderson patted her arm. "But he left this at the door." She pressed a small leather pouch into Tessa's hand, heavy with coin. Tessa stared at it, her throat tightening. "I cannot accept this. I do not even know who he is." "Name's Tanner Vale, according to what he told me. Said he owed Thomas a debt from way back, and this was the least he could do." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "Pride's a fine thing, dear, but that baby needs you practical more than proud right now." Tessa's fingers closed around the pouch even as shame burned in her chest. She had never taken charity in her life, had always worked for everything she had, but Mrs. Henderson was right. The baby's needs outweighed her pride. That night, lying in the narrow bed with her hand on her belly, Tessa felt the child move for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings against her palm. Tears streaked down her temples into her hair as she whispered to the darkness, "I will take care of you, I promise, whatever it takes." The next morning she counted the coins in the pouch and found enough to cover her room and board for another month, maybe 2 if she was careful. It bought her time, but it did not solve the fundamental problem. She needed work, needed a way to support herself and the baby once it arrived. In Trail's End, opportunities for women were limited to cooking, cleaning, or worse. Tessa spent the morning walking through the settlement, inquiring at every establishment. The general store owner shook his head apologetically. The saloon keeper looked her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl before she cut him off mid-sentence and walked out. The small restaurant that served the occasional travelers said they could barely afford to pay their current cook. By noon, she found herself at the edge of town again, staring at the trail that led into the mountains. Somewhere out there, a man named Tanner Vale had known her husband well enough to leave money for his widow. The mystery gnawed at her. Thomas had never mentioned anyone by that name, but then he had been a quiet man, not given to stories about his past. "Looking for something?" The voice came from behind her, deep and rough like gravel underfoot. Tessa spun around and found herself face to face with the largest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, and arms corded with muscle visible even through his worn buckskin shirt. Dark hair fell past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes were startlingly clear, a pale gray that seemed to see straight through her defenses. "You are Tanner Vale." It was not a question. "I am." He stood perfectly still, as if aware that his size might frighten her. "You are Thomas's wife." "Widow," she corrected automatically, then hated how bitter the word sounded. "I wanted to thank you for the money, but I cannot accept charity." Something flickered in those gray eyes. "It is not charity. I owed Thomas my life. Money is poor payment for that kind of debt, but it is what I have to offer. Tessa studied him, trying to reconcile this mountain man with her quiet, bookish husband. How did you know him? Long story. Tanner glanced at the sun, then back at her. Have you eaten today? That's none of your concern. That would be a no then. He gestured toward the small restaurant. Come on, you can listen to me talk while you eat, and then decide if you want to keep the money or throw it back in my face. Despite herself, Tessa felt her lips twitch toward a smile. There was something disarming about his blunt honesty. I suppose I could eat something. The restaurant owner's eyebrows rose when they entered together, but she brought them stew and bread without comment. Tanner waited until Tessa had taken several bites before he began speaking. Met your husband in 1869, up in the Colorado Territory. I was trapping beaver, and he was surveying land for the railroad. Got himself turned around in a blizzard and would have frozen to death if I had not stumbled across his camp. Tanner broke off a piece of bread, his massive hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate crust. Stayed with me through the winter, helped with the trapping. He was not built for mountain life, but he never complained. Worked hard, kept his word. Tessa listened, hungry for any details about the man she had married only 2 years ago. Thomas had been educated, unusual for these parts, with beautiful handwriting and a love of books. She had met him in Missouri, where he had been working as a surveyor's assistant, and they had married quickly, drawn together by loneliness and genuine affection, but he had rarely spoken of his life before. When spring came, I guided him back to Denver, Tanner continued. Before we parted ways, he helped me with some legal trouble. I'm not good with words on paper, and there were men trying to claim my land up in the mountains. Thomas wrote letters, filed paperwork, made sure everything was legal and proper. Saved me from losing everything. He met her eyes directly. So when I heard what happened to him, and that he left behind a pregnant wife with no means, I figured it was time to settle my debt. You came all the way from Colorado? Tessa's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Been living in the mountains north of here for the past year. Heard about the ambush from some trappers passing through. His expression darkened. Thomas was a good man, did not deserve to die like that. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of grief settling between them. Tessa forced herself to take another bite of stew, though it tasted like ash in her mouth. The money will help, she said finally, but I need work, something I can do even as the baby gets closer. I cannot just survive on charity, even if you call it a debt. Tanner leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. What kind of work are you looking for? Anything respectable. I can cook, clean, sew, keep accounts. Thomas taught me to read and write properly. She lifted her chin, refusing to show how desperate she felt. I'm not afraid of hard work. I believe that. Tanner was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. I have a proposition, but you will probably want to throw that stew in my face when you hear it. Tessa's spine stiffened. If you are about to suggest something improper, you can save your breath. Not improper, practical. He held up one large hand as she started to rise. Just hear me out, then decide. I have a cabin about 10 miles north of here, up in the foothills. Good land, creek running through it, plenty of game. I come into town for supplies maybe once a month, but otherwise I live alone. Have for years now. And, Tessa's voice was cold, and that cabin is bigger than what I need. Plenty of room for 2 people, even 3 once the baby comes. Tanner spoke carefully, as if navigating a minefield. I'm not suggesting anything romantic or improper. What I'm suggesting is a practical arrangement. You need somewhere safe to live and someone to help provide for you and the child. I could use someone to manage the household, do the cooking and mending, maybe help with preserving meat and tanning hides. In return, you would have a roof over your head, food in your belly, and protection. Tessa stared at him, her heart hammering. You want me to live with you? In separate quarters, he said firmly. The cabin has a small bedroom off the main room. You would have privacy and your reputation intact. And I give you my word, on Thomas's memory, that I would never touch you or expect anything beyond what I said. Household help in exchange for safety and provision. People would talk, even as she said it, even as she... Tessa knew how weak it sounded. People were already talking, whispering about the pregnant widow with no prospects. Let them talk. You would be 10 miles away, and by the time the baby comes, it will be winter. No one travels these parts in winter." Tanner's expression was unreadable behind his beard. "Think about it. You do not have to answer now." But Tessa was already thinking about it, her practical mind running through the calculations. Winter in a boarding house with a newborn baby, trying to find work while caring for an infant, the constant scraping to make ends meet. Against that, a cabin in the mountains with a man who claimed to owe her dead husband a debt. It seemed insane. It also seemed like the only real option she had. "Why would you do this?" she asked quietly. "Truly. You barely knew Thomas, and you do not know me at all." Tanner was quiet for so long, she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Because he saved my life, and more than that, he treated me like I was worth something. Most people look at me and see a savage, someone too rough for civilized company. Thomas saw a person. He shared his books with me, taught me more about reading in that winter than I had learned in all the years before. When I had nowhere else to go, he gave me hope." His hands clenched on the table. "I cannot bring him back, but I can make sure his child and his wife do not suffer." Tessa felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had shed since hearing about Thomas's death. "I need time to think about this." "Of course." Tanner rose, dropping coins on the table to pay for the meal. "I will be camping just outside town for the next few days, up where the creek bends east. If you decide you want to take me up on the offer, come find me. If not, keep the money and I will wish you well." He left without waiting for a response, his massive frame disappearing through the doorway. Tessa sat alone at the table, her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move inside her. She thought about Thomas, about the man he had been, and the stories he had never told her. She thought about winter coming and the fear that gnawed at her every waking moment. That night, she barely slept. By morning, her decision was made. She found Tanner's camp where he said it would be, a simple tent beside the creek with a fire burning low. He was skinning a rabbit when she approached, his knife moving with practiced precision. He looked up at her arrival, but did not speak, waiting for her to break the silence. "I have conditions," Tessa said without preamble. Tanner set down the rabbit and wiped his knife clean. "I am listening." "Separate sleeping quarters, as you said. You do not come into my room unless invited. I do the household work, but I'm not a servant. You treat me with respect, and I will do the same for you." She lifted her chin, channeling every ounce of courage she possessed. "And this arrangement lasts until spring. After the baby is born and the weather clears, we revisit the terms. If either of us wants to end it, we can do so with no hard feelings." "Fair enough." Tanner stood, offering his hand. "Do we have an agreement?" Tessa looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and scarred from years of mountain living. Then she thought of the alternative, of the fear and uncertainty that awaited her in Trail's End. She reached out and shook his hand, feeling the strength in his grip and the careful gentleness with which he held her smaller hand. "We have an agreement." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Tanner helped her settle her affairs in town, paying off her room at the boarding house and purchasing supplies for the cabin. Mrs. Henderson clicked her tongue in disapproval, but said nothing, perhaps recognizing that Tessa had few choices available to her. They left Trail's End on a crisp October morning, Tessa riding a gentle mare that Tanner had purchased specifically for her, while he walked alongside leading a pack mule laden with supplies. The trail into the foothills was rough but navigable, and Tanner set an easy pace, mindful of her condition. "How far along are you?" he asked as they paused beside a stream to let the animals drink. "Almost 4 months." Tessa shifted in the saddle, her back already aching. "The baby should come in late February or early March." Tanner nodded thoughtfully. "We will have plenty of time to prepare then. The cabin is weather-tight, and I have been storing food for winter. There's a woman named Sarah who lives about 5 miles west, married to a trapper named Jim. She has had 4 babies of her own, might be willing to help when your time comes." The thought of giving birth in a mountain cabin with only strangers to help terrified Tessa, but she pushed the fear down. She had made her choice. There was no point in dwelling on the dangers. They reached the cabin as the sun reached its zenith. Tessa's first glimpse of her new home made her breath catch. The structure was larger than she had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. It sat in a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by pine trees that whispered in the breeze. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "It is beautiful," she said softly. Tanner looked pleased. "Built it myself 5 years ago. Should see you through any weather." Inside, the cabin was Spartan but well made. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs and shelves lined with supplies. A door on the far wall led to the small bedroom Tanner had mentioned, barely large enough for a bed and a small trunk, but private. "I will sleep out here," Tanner said, gesturing to the main room. "Made myself a bedroll that works fine by the fire. The bedroom is yours." Tessa explored her new quarters, finding them clean if sparse. Someone, probably Tanner, had made up the bed with wool blankets and placed a small oil lamp on a wooden crate beside it. A tiny window looked out on the creek, and she could hear the water burbling over stones. They spent the rest of the day unloading supplies and settling in. Tanner showed her where everything was stored, how to work the water pump he had installed just outside the door, where he kept the firewood stacked and covered. He moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, his massive frame seeming almost too large for the domestic space. That first night, Tessa cooked dinner for both of them, making biscuits and beans with salt pork. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire the only sound. It felt strange, surreal, to be sitting across from this man she barely knew, sharing a meal in the wilderness. "Thank you," Tanner said as he finished eating. "Been a long time since I had proper biscuits." "They are just biscuits." Tessa rose to clear the plates, but he stopped her. "You cooked, I clean. That seems fair." She watched as he carefully washed the dishes in a basin, his large hands gentle with the tin plates. There was something oddly comforting about his presence, the quiet competence with which he moved through tasks. He was nothing like Thomas, nothing like any man she had known, but he did not frighten her the way she had expected. The days fell into a rhythm. Tessa woke each morning to find Tanner already up, the fire burning and water heating for washing. He would check his trap lines or hunt while she prepared breakfast and tidied the cabin. They ate together, conversation gradually becoming easier as they grew accustomed to each other's presence. Tanner was not much for words, but when he spoke, he said things worth hearing. He taught her about the mountains, pointing out animal tracks in the snow that began to fall in early November, showing her which plants were edible and which were poisonous. He brought her firewood without being asked and made sure she never had to carry anything heavy. For her part, Tessa threw herself into making the cabin more of a home. She sewed curtains from spare fabric, organized the shelves, and experimented with preserving the meat Tanner brought back from his hunts. She mended his clothes, which were often torn from his time in the wilderness, and was surprised to find satisfaction in the simple domesticity of it all. Her belly grew rounder as November gave way to December. Tanner noticed her struggling to reach things on high shelves one day and spent an afternoon rearranging the entire storage system so everything she needed regularly was within easy reach. He asked permission before moving anything, treating her space with respect. "You do not have to do all this," Tessa said, watching him work. "Want to," he replied simply. "You should be comfortable." The first real snow came in mid-December, blanketing the world in white silence. Tessa stood at the window watching it fall, one hand on her belly where the baby kicked and tumbled. She had been here nearly 2 months now, and Trail's End felt like another lifetime. "You miss town?" Tanner asked from where he sat by the fire, working on repairing a beaver trap. "No." The answer surprised her with its honesty. "I thought I would, but I do not. It is peaceful here." "Gets lonely sometimes," he admitted. "Nice having someone to talk to." Tessa turned to look at him. In the firelight, with his concentration focused on the trap in his hands, he looked younger than she had first thought. She realized she did not even know his age. "How old are you, Tanner?" He glanced up, seeming surprised by the question. 28? Why?" "Just curious. You seem older sometimes, then younger others." She moved to sit at the table, her back aching from standing too long. "I will be 23 next month." "January, baby." Tanner set aside the trap. "We should do something special for it. In the middle of winter in a mountain cabin, what could we possibly do?" But she was smiling as she said it. "I will think of something." Christmas came quietly. Tanner brought in a small pine tree and set it up in the corner, and Tessa made decorations from scraps of fabric and pine cones. They had no gifts to exchange, but Tanner surprised her by producing a book from his pack, one of the volumes Thomas had given him years ago. "Thought you might like to have it," he said gruffly, since it was his. Tessa held the book carefully, running her fingers over Thomas's name, written in careful script on the inside cover. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than you know." They spent Christmas evening reading aloud by the fire, taking turns with passages from the book. Tanner's reading had improved considerably since his winter with Thomas, though he still stumbled over longer words. Tessa found herself enjoying the sound of his deep voice working through the sentences, the furrow of concentration on his brow. January brought bitter cold and heavy snows that sometimes kept them confined to the cabin for days at a time. Tessa's belly was enormous now, the baby constantly active. She struggled to find comfortable positions for sleeping and often woke to find Tanner already up, having heard her moving around in the night. "Cannot sleep?" he asked one such morning, looking concerned. "Baby seems to think nighttime is for gymnastics," she said ruefully, pressing a hand to her side where a foot was jabbing her ribs. Tanner looked uncertain, then said, "My mother used to say walking helped when she was carrying my younger brother. Could walk around the cabin some if you want. I will keep the fire high so you do not get cold." Tessa took him up on the offer, pacing slow circles around the main room while Tanner pretended to be absorbed in his own tasks. But she noticed how he watched her from the corner of his eye, ready to catch her if she stumbled. Her birthday came on a particularly cold January night. Tessa had not mentioned it, but somehow Tanner had remembered. She woke to find the cabin filled with the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee, luxuries he rarely indulged in. On the table sat a small carved figure, a woman holding a baby, made from pine wood and polished smooth. "Made it for you," Tanner said, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Not much, but I wanted you to have something." Tessa picked up the carving, marveling at the delicate detail work. The woman's face was serene, protective, the baby cradled safely in her arms. "It is beautiful. I did not know you could carve like this. Learned from an old trapper years back. Helps pass the time in winter." He looked pleased by her reaction. "Happy birthday, Tessa." It was the first time he had used her given name instead of calling her Mrs. Owen, or just avoiding names altogether. The intimacy of it made something warm unfold in her chest. "Thank you, Tanner. Truly." They celebrated with a special breakfast, and then spent the day as they usually did, but something had shifted between them. The walls of formality that had existed since the beginning were crumbling, replaced by something more genuine. Tessa found herself seeking out his company, asking his opinion on things that did not really matter, just to hear his voice. And Tanner, taciturn and solitary by nature, seemed to open up in small increments, sharing stories of his life in the mountains, the years of solitude that had shaped him. "Why did you choose this life?" Tessa asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her feet propped on a stool Tanner had made to ease her swollen ankles. "Living alone up here, away from everyone." Tanner was quiet for a long moment. "Grew up in a town, small place in Missouri. My father was a drunk who liked to use his fists. My mother died when I was 14, and after that, there was nothing keeping me there. Headed west, worked as a hand on wagon trains, then discovered I preferred the company of mountains to people." He stared into the flames. "Up here, nobody judges you. Nobody expects you to be anything other than what you are." "Do you ever get lonely?" The question slipped out before Tessa could stop it. "Used to tell myself I did not," he admitted. "But yeah, I do. Sometimes the silence is so deep it feels like drowning." His gray eyes met hers. "Been different these past months, having you here. I forgot what it was like to have someone to talk to at the end of the day." "I know what you mean." Tessa found herself holding his gaze, seeing past the rough exterior to the man beneath. "I thought I would feel like a prisoner here, trapped by circumstance, but instead, I feel safer than I have since Thomas died. Maybe safer than I ever have." The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick, making Tessa gasp and press her hand to her belly. Tanner was on his feet instantly, concern written across his face. "Are you all right? Is it time?" No, just active." She laughed at his expression. "Still have a few weeks to go, I think." He relaxed slightly but did not sit back down. Should probably ride out to Jim and Sarah's place soon. Let them know the baby is getting close. Want Sarah to know she might be needed? The thought of labor terrified Tessa, but she nodded. That would be wise. Tanner made the journey the next day, returning with Sarah herself, a sturdy woman in her 30s with kind eyes and capable hands. She looked Tessa over with a practiced eye and pronounced her healthy but close to her time. Could be any day now, could be another month, Sarah said pragmatically. Babies come when they're ready. But you look strong, and the baby seems active. That is good. She turned to Tanner. You ever helped with a birthing before? He looked like he wanted to run for the hills. No, madam, Sarah smiled. Well, you might have to learn. I will come when the time is right, but if things happen fast, you will need to help her. Nothing to be afraid of. Women have been having babies since the dawn of time. After Sarah left, promising to return at the first sign of labor, Tanner seemed more nervous than Tessa had ever seen him. He checked and rechecked the supplies Sarah had recommended they have on hand, made sure there was plenty of firewood and water, and generally hovered in a way that might have been annoying if it had not been so endearing. Tanner, Tessa said finally, catching his arm as he passed by for the dozenth time. I'm not going to break. I know, but he looked uncertain. I just want to make sure you have everything you need. What I need is for you to sit down and breathe. She tugged him toward the chair. You're making me anxious with all this pacing. He sat, looking abashed. Sorry. I just keep thinking about what could go wrong. So do I, Tessa admitted, every minute of every day. But worrying will not change anything. Either everything will be fine or it will not, and all we can do is be as prepared as possible. You are braver than I am, he said quietly. Tessa laughed. I hardly think the woman who is terrified of giving birth is braver than the man who lives alone in the wilderness and hunts bears. I would rather face a bear than watch you go through what is coming, Tanner said with complete sincerity. At least with a bear, I can fight back. Something in his words, in the raw honesty of them, made Tessa's heart skip. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the concern etched in every line of his face, the fear he was trying so hard to hide. He cared about her, she realized, not just as an obligation to Thomas, but as a person in her own right. I will be all right, she said softly, and I will not be alone. You will be here. I will be here, he promised, every moment. I am not going anywhere. The baby came 3 days later, on a February night when the wind howled around the cabin and snow piled high against the walls. Tessa woke to pain that took her breath away, radiating from her belly through her entire body. She cried out before she could stop herself, and within seconds, Tanner was at her bedroom door. Tessa? His voice was rough with sleep and alarm. Is it time? I think so. She tried to sit up, but another contraction hit, doubling her over. Oh God, it hurts. I'm getting Sarah. Tanner was already moving, pulling on his boots and coat. Stay calm, try to breathe. I will be back as fast as I can. He disappeared into the storm, leaving Tessa alone with her fear and pain. She had never felt so helpless, so utterly at the mercy of forces beyond her control. The contractions came in waves, each one stronger than the last, and she gripped the blankets and tried to remember how to breathe. Time became meaningless, measured only in the spaces between pain. She was vaguely aware of stumbling out of bed, pacing the floor because staying still was impossible. The fire burned low, and she knew she should add wood, but she could barely stand when the contractions hit. Then Tanner was back, snow dusting his shoulders, Sarah right behind him. The older woman took one look at Tessa and sprang into action, sending Tanner for water and blankets, examining Tessa with gentle, efficient hands. You're doing fine, honey, Sarah said calmly. Baby is coming fast, though. First ones usually take their time, but this little one is in a hurry. The next hours were a blur of pain and effort. Sarah coached her through each contraction, showing her how to breathe, when to push. Tanner stayed close, letting Tessa grip his hand until she thought she might break his fingers, murmuring encouragement when she was sure she could not go on. Almost there, Sarah said. One more good push, Tessa. Come on, you can do this. Tessa bore down with everything she had left, and suddenly the pressure released in a rush. A baby's cry filled the cabin, strong and indignant, and she collapsed back against the pillows, shaking with exhaustion and relief. You have a son, Sarah announced, wrapping the baby in clean cloth and laying him on Tessa's chest. A big, healthy boy. Tessa looked down at her son, at his tiny red face and waving fists, and felt her heart crack open with a love so fierce it hurt. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one." Tanner stood beside the bed, his face showing more emotion than she had ever seen from him. He looked at the baby with something like awe, then at Tessa with undisguised relief. "You did it. You were so brave." "We did it," she corrected, remembering his steady presence through the long night. "I could not have managed without you." Sarah stayed for 2 days, making sure both Tessa and the baby were healthy and teaching Tessa how to nurse and care for an infant. The baby latched on immediately, nursing with the same determination he had shown in being born, and Sarah pronounced them both healthy. "You are a natural mother," she said approvingly, "and you have good help here." She glanced meaningfully at Tanner, who was hovering in the background like an anxious bear. Not every man would have been so steady through a birthing. After Sarah left, the cabin settled into a new routine. Tessa spent most of her time in bed recovering, the baby cradled against her chest. Tanner took over all the household tasks, cooking and cleaning with surprising skill, and whenever the baby cried in the night, he was there within moments, asking if she needed anything. "What will you name him?" Tanner asked one evening as he sat beside the bed, watching the baby sleep in Tessa's arms. "I have been thinking about that." Tessa stroked her son's downy hair. "I want to name him Thomas after his father, Thomas Vale Owen." Tanner's head snapped up. "Vale?" "For you," Tessa said softly, "because without you, neither of us would be here. You gave us safety and protection when we had nothing. That deserves to be honored." He looked overwhelmed, his eyes bright with emotion. "I do not know what to say." "Say you will be part of his life. Say you will teach him about the mountains and how to be a good man." Tessa met his gaze steadily. "Say you will stay." "I will stay," Tanner said hoarsely, "as long as you will have me." The baby, Thomas, thrived in the mountain cabin. He was a good-natured child, sleeping in long stretches and nursing well, and Tessa found herself falling into the rhythm of motherhood with surprising ease. Tanner proved to be an unexpected help, rocking the baby when he was fussy, entertaining him with silly faces that made Tessa laugh, and generally being as gentle as his large frame allowed. February gave way to March, and the agreement they had made loomed in the back of Tessa's mind. Spring would come soon, and with it, the need to revisit the terms of their arrangement. But every time she thought about leaving, about taking Thomas and returning to Trail's End, her heart contracted painfully. She did not want to leave. Somewhere between that first awkward dinner and now, this cabin had become home. Tanner had become someone essential to her life, someone she could not imagine doing without. One evening, with Thomas asleep in a cradle Tanner had made, they sat by the fire in comfortable silence. The spring thaw had begun, water dripping from the eaves, and Tessa knew the conversation could not be postponed much longer. "The snows will be gone soon," she said quietly. Tanner's hand stilled on the trap he was repairing. "I know. We said we would revisit our arrangement in spring." "We did." He did not look at her, his attention fixed on the metal in his hands. Tessa took a breath, gathering her courage. "I do not want to leave." Now he did look up, his gray eyes intense. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this place feels like home, that I cannot imagine being anywhere else, doing anything else, that She faltered, then pushed forward. "That I care about you, Tanner, more than I probably should, given how this started." He set the trap aside and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his much larger ones. "I care about you too. Have for a while now, though I tried not to. Felt wrong with you being Thomas's widow and all. But Tessa, you have become the most important thing in my life. You and the baby, the thought of you leaving, of this cabin being empty again." He shook his head. "I do not think I could bear it." "Then I will not leave," Tessa said simply, "unless you want me to." "Never." The word was fierce, certain. "I want you to stay forever, if you will. I want to be a father to Thomas and a husband to you, if you will have me. I know I am not educated like your first husband, not refined or proper, but I swear I will spend every day trying to make you happy." Tessa felt tears slip down her cheeks. "You already make me happy. You have, since the beginning. I just did not want to admit it. It felt like a betrayal of Thomas's memory." "Thomas would want you to be happy," Tanner said gently. He would want his son to have a father and you to have someone who loves you. Do you love me? Her voice was barely a whisper. With everything I am. He reached up to cup her face, his calloused thumb wiping away her tears. I know it is too soon, that I should wait a proper amount of time. But yes, Tessa Owen, I love you. I think I have since that first day when you stood up to me in the restaurant, all fire and courage despite being terrified. I love you too. The words felt right, true in a way that made her whole body warm. I think I started falling for you that day you rearranged all the shelves so I could reach everything. It was such a small thing, but it showed me who you really are. Tanner leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Tessa did not want to pull away. She met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promise and hope. When they finally broke apart, Tanner rested his forehead against hers. Marry me. Properly, with vows and everything. I want the whole world to know you are mine and I am yours. Yes, Tessa said, laughing through her tears. Yes, I will marry you. They married in early April, with Jim and Sarah serving as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, held in the cabin with the door open to let in the spring air, but Tessa had never felt happier. She wore a dress she had sewn herself, and Tanner had trimmed his beard and hair, looking almost civilized in clean clothes. When the preacher from Trail's End pronounced them husband and wife, Tanner kissed her with such tenderness that Sarah wiped away tears. Little Thomas, now 2 months old, slept peacefully through the whole ceremony, wrapped in blankets in his cradle. That night, after their guests had left, Tanner carried Tessa over the threshold of the bedroom, making her laugh at the traditional gesture in their very untraditional circumstances. I want to do this right, he said, setting her gently on the bed. Want you to know how much you mean to me. He made love to her with exquisite care, mindful of her body still recovering from childbirth, and Tessa marveled at the gentleness in his strong hands, the tenderness in every touch. This was nothing like her marriage to Thomas, which had been warm and affectionate, but never passionate. With Tanner, she felt truly alive, every nerve-ending singing with sensation. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Tanner's large frame curled protectively around her smaller one. I cannot believe this is real, Tessa murmured against his chest. 6 months ago, I was alone and terrified, certain I would never be happy again. Now, I have you and Thomas in this life. It seems impossible. Best kind of impossible, Tanner rumbled, his voice sleepy and content. My wife. Still cannot believe I get to say that. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and when Thomas woke hungry in the night, Tanner got up to bring him to Tessa, then stayed awake watching while she nursed, his expression full of love and wonder. The months that followed were the happiest of Tessa's life. Spring bloomed into summer, and she learned the rhythms of mountain living, working side by side with Tanner to maintain their home. They expanded the garden, putting in vegetables that would see them through the next winter, and Tanner built a small addition onto the cabin, creating more space for their growing family. Thomas grew quickly, becoming a chubby, cheerful baby who adored his parents equally. Tanner proved to be a devoted father, carrying the baby in a sling while he worked, teaching him the names of birds and trees, even though Thomas was far too young to understand. Watching them together made Tessa's heart swell with love. In late summer, Tessa realized she was pregnant again. The news surprised her, though it probably should not have, given how much time she and Tanner spent wrapped in each other's arms. When she told him, Tanner picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. Another baby, he said wonderingly. Our baby. You do not mind? Tessa felt uncertain. Thomas was barely 6 months old after all. Mind? Tessa, I'm thrilled. He set her down carefully, his hands moving to her still flat stomach. I love Thomas like he was my own, but knowing we created this together, that it is a piece of both of us. He shook his head, too overcome to finish. This pregnancy was easier than her first, perhaps because she was not grieving and afraid. Tessa bloomed with health, and Tanner doted on her shamelessly, bringing her wildflowers and making sure she rested enough. They told Thomas about his new sibling, though at 6 months old, he mostly just gurgled and grabbed at their faces. Winter came again, their second together, but this time Tessa was not a frightened widow, but a wife and mother in her own home. She and Tanner spent the long evenings by the fire, reading aloud or simply talking, while Thomas played on a blanket at their feet. These quiet moments were precious, the foundation of the life they were building together. "What do you hope for?" Tanner asked one night. "For the future, I mean." Tessa considered. "I hope our children grow up healthy and happy. I hope we can give them a good life, teach them to be kind and strong. I hope we have many years together, growing old in this cabin." She smiled at him. "What about you?" "I hope for all of that," he said, "and I hope I can always make you as happy as you look right now. That is all I really want, Tessa. Your happiness." "Then you will have your wish," she said softly, "because I am very happy." The second baby, a daughter they named Temperance after Tessa's mother, arrived in early March with far less drama than Thomas's birth. Sarah was there from the start this time, and though labor was still hard work, it went quickly. Tanner held Tessa's hand through it all, and when their daughter was born, he cried openly, holding the tiny girl with infinite care. "She is perfect," he said, his voice choked with emotion, just like her mother. Thomas, now almost a year old and walking, was fascinated by his new sister, wanting to touch her tiny hands and feet. They had to watch him carefully, but his interest was gentle, protective even at his young age. "You are a good big brother," Tessa told him, holding Temperance while Thomas patted the baby's head. "You will help us take care of her, won't you?" Thomas babbled something that might have been agreement, and Tanner laughed, scooping his son up into his arms. "We're going to have our hands full with these two." "Worth it, though," Tessa said, watching her husband with their children, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The years passed in a blur of milestones and quiet moments. Thomas grew into a sturdy toddler, then a little boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to track animals and identify plants. Temperance was a sweet-natured baby who rarely cried and seemed content to be carried around on her mother's hip while Tessa worked. They made trips into Trail's End a few times each year for supplies, and Tessa always marveled at how different she felt from the frightened widow who had arrived years ago. Now she walked with confidence, Tanner at her side and her children in her arms, and if people still gossiped, she did not care. She had everything she needed. When Thomas was 3 and Temperance nearly 2, Tessa found herself pregnant again. This time, the baby came in winter, a boy they named Timothy. Tanner took the growing family in stride, expanding the cabin again to add another small bedroom, working constantly to make sure they had everything they needed. "You are going to work yourself to death," Tessa scolded one evening, watching him sand down a new cradle by lamplight. "Want my family to be comfortable," he said simply. "Besides, I like doing this, building things for our children, making this place more of a home. Makes me happy." Tessa moved to stand behind him, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. "You make me happy, every single day." He turned in her embrace, pulling her close. "That's all I ever wanted. From that first day in the restaurant, when you looked at me like you were ready to fight the world, I wanted to be the one who gave you reasons to smile instead. You have given me so much more than that." Tessa looked up at him, at the face she had come to love more than she ever thought possible. "You gave me a home, a family, a life worth living. You saved me, Tanner Vale." "We saved each other," he corrected, kissing her forehead. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions. You made me remember what it was to really live." They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the sounds of their sleeping children soft in the background. This was home, Tessa thought. Not the cabin, not the mountains, but this, the family they had built together from loss and loneliness. The children grew and thrived. Thomas inherited his father's love of the outdoors, spending hours exploring the mountains with Tanner. Temperance was quieter, preferring to stay close to her mother, learning to cook and sew and tend the garden. Timothy was still a baby, but already showing signs of being as stubborn as both his parents. When Thomas was 5, old enough to understand, Tessa told him about his birth father, about the man named Thomas Owen, who had been good and kind, and who had loved him before he was even born. She showed him the book Tanner had given her, with Thomas Owen's name inscribed inside. "So I have 2 fathers?" Thomas asked, his young face serious. "You have one father who loved you before you were born and wanted the best for you," Tessa said carefully, And you have another father who loves you every day and is here to watch you grow. Both are part of who you are." Thomas thought about this, then asked, "Does that mean I am lucky?" Very lucky," Tanner said from the doorway, coming to join them. "Because you get to carry two good men's names, and you have your mother who loves you more than anything." Thomas seemed satisfied with this answer, and as he grew older, he wore both names with pride, telling anyone who asked that he was named for two fathers, both heroes in their own way. Life in the mountains was not always easy. There were harsh winters and failed crops, illnesses that scared them, and close calls with wild animals. But through it all, Tessa and Tanner faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each challenge they overcame. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Tanner surprised Tessa by taking her to a spot high in the mountains, leaving the children with Sarah for the day. They hiked to a meadow filled with wildflowers, overlooking a valley that stretched for miles in every direction. "This is where I first thought about settling down," Tanner said, taking her hand. "Years ago, before I met Thomas, before I knew you existed, I stood here and thought that if I ever found a reason to stop wandering, this would be where I would want to be." "It is beautiful," Tessa said, taking in the vast expanse of land and sky. "I never did build here," he continued. "Built the cabin down in the foothills instead. But I kept this land, thinking maybe someday I would use it." He turned to face her, his gray eyes intense. "I want to give it to Thomas, to our Thomas. When he is old enough to settle down, have his own family, this land will be his. A legacy from both his fathers, the man who gave him life and the man who raised him." Tessa felt tears slip down her cheeks. "He will love it. And so will Thomas Owen, wherever he is. You have honored his memory more than you know, Tanner. You took care of his son, loved his widow, gave us the family he would have wanted us to have." "I hope he knows," Tanner said quietly. "I hope somehow he knows that they are all right, that they are loved and safe, that I kept my promise." "He knows," Tessa said with certainty, "and he is grateful, just as I am." They stood together in the meadow, overlooking the land that would one day belong to their son, and Tessa thought about the strange paths life took. She had come to Trail's End, a widow with nothing, and a mountain man had been waiting there, ready to walk her home with him. It had not been the life she expected, but it was the life she was meant to have. The years continued to unfold. Temperance grew into a lovely girl with her father's gray eyes and her mother's determination. Timothy proved to be a handful, always getting into mischief and leading his siblings on adventures through the mountains. And Thomas, the eldest, became a responsible young man who looked after his younger siblings with the same protective instinct his father showed. Tessa and Tanner added one more child to their family, another daughter they named Tabitha, born when Temperance was 6. The cabin rang with children's laughter and occasional arguments, with the sounds of a full, busy life. Tanner built furniture and hunted to keep them fed, while Tessa managed the household and taught the children their letters and numbers. On quiet evenings, after the children were in bed, Tessa and Tanner would sit by the fire, as they had from the beginning, talking about their day or simply being together. These moments were precious, a reminder of how far they had come from that first awkward meal in Trail's End. "Do you ever regret it?" Tessa asked one such evening. "Taking in a pregnant widow and her baby? You could have had such an easier life." "Easier, maybe," Tanner said, pulling her close against his side. "But not better, not even close to better. You and the children are the best things that ever happened to me. I was half alive before you, Tessa. Now I am fully living, every day." "I feel the same way," she said softly. "You took me in when I had nothing and gave me everything. I will never stop being grateful for that." "You do not need to be grateful," he said firmly. "What we have this life, we built it together. You gave me just as much as I gave you. More, probably." They kissed in the firelight, the taste of 5 years of marriage and partnership, and love in that simple gesture. Outside, snow fell softly over the mountains, blanketing their world in silence. Inside, the cabin was warm and safe, filled with the evidence of their life together. Years later, when Thomas was 15 and preparing to eventually claim his land in the high meadow, he asked his mother about how she and his father had met. They sat on the porch of the cabin, which Tanner had expanded yet again to accommodate their growing children, watching the sun set over the mountains. Tessa told him the story, leaving nothing out. She told him about his birth father's death, about arriving in Trail's End pregnant and alone, about the mountain man who had offered her a home when she had nowhere else to go. "So you married father because you had to?" Thomas asked, his young face troubled. "No," Tessa said firmly. "I married your father because I fell in love with him. The arrangement we started with was practical, yes, but what we have now, what we have had for years, is real love. The deepest, truest kind of love, built on respect and partnership and genuine affection. Your father is the best man I know, Thomas. He took on another man's child as his own, loved us both without reservation, and built this life for us with his own hands." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad he waited for you at Trail's End. I'm glad he walked you home with him." "So am I," Tessa said, her eyes finding Tanner where he worked in the garden with Temperance. "Every single day, I'm glad." That night, lying in bed with Tanner's arms around her, Tessa thought about the journey that had brought them here. From grief and fear to love and family, from strangers with an arrangement to husband and wife with a lifetime of memories between them. It had not been the path she expected, but it was the right one. "What are you thinking about?" Tanner asked, his voice rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "About how much I love you," she said simply. "About how grateful I am that you waited for me at Trail's End, that you were brave enough to offer help to a desperate widow." "Best decision I ever made," he said, tightening his arms around her. "You are my everything, Tessa, you and the children, my whole world." "And you are mine," she whispered. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for countless nights before, secure in their love and the life they had built together in the mountains. As the years passed and their children grew, eventually leaving to build their own lives, Tessa and Tanner remained in their cabin, growing old together as they had always planned. Thomas claimed his land in the high meadow and built a home there with his wife, while Temperance married a trapper's son and settled nearby. Timothy headed further west, always adventurous, but promised to visit often. Tabitha, their youngest, stayed close, marrying a man from Trail's End and keeping the connection to the town that had been the beginning of everything. Grandchildren came, filling the cabin with noise and laughter during visits, and Tanner proved to be as devoted a grandfather as he had been a father, carrying babies and telling stories and teaching his grandchildren the ways of the mountains. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Tessa and Tanner returned to the high meadow where he had proposed giving the land to Thomas. They moved slower now, their bodies showing the wear of 2 decades of hard mountain living, but their love was as strong as ever. 20 years, Tessa said, looking out over the valley. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like forever." "Best 20 years of my life," Tanner said, his hair more gray than brown now, his beard shot through with silver. "Would not change a single moment." "Not even the hard times?" Tessa teased. "The winter when we all got sick, the year the crops failed, when Timothy broke his arm climbing where he should not have been?" "Not even those," Tanner said seriously, "because we faced them together, and they made us stronger. Everything we have been through brought us here, to this moment, and I would not trade this for anything." Tessa leaned against his solid strength, marveling at how safe she still felt in his arms after all these years. "I love you, Tanner Vale, more now than even on our wedding day." "I love you too, Tessa Vale," he said, using the name she had taken as her own when they married. "Forever and always." They stood together in the meadow, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built a love that would last a lifetime. The mountains stretched out before them, eternal and unchanging, but within them, everything had changed. A pregnant widow had come to Trail's End with nothing, and a mountain man had been waiting there to walk her home with him, and from that simple beginning, they had created something beautiful. Years later, when they were old and gray, their children grown with children of their own, Tessa and Tanner would sit on the porch of their cabin and watch the sunset over the mountains they had called home for so long. And every evening, as the light faded and the stars began to appear, Tanner would take Tessa's hand and say the same thing he had said every night since they married. "Grateful you said yes, grateful you stayed." And Tessa would squeeze his hand and reply, "Grateful you asked, grateful you waited." They lived their remaining years in peace and contentment, surrounded by the family they had created and the love that had sustained them through everything. When the time came for them to leave this world, they went as they had lived the best parts of their lives, together, hands clasped, secure in the knowledge that their love had been real and true, and worth every moment. Their children and grandchildren would tell the story for generations after about the pregnant widow who came to Trail's End and the mountain man who waited there to walk her home with him, about how an arrangement born of desperation became one of the greatest love stories the mountains had ever seen. And in telling it, they would honor not just Tessa and Tanner, but the idea that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, that home is not where you are, but who you are with, and that sometimes the best things in life come from taking a chance on hope when fear seems easier. The cabin still stands in the foothills, passed down through the family, a testament to the life built there by two people who found each other when they needed it most. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the pines, some say you can still feel the love that filled those walls, the warmth of a family gathered around the fire, the sound of laughter and contentment that echoed through the years. This is the story of Tessa Owen, who came to Trail's End a widow with nothing, and Tanner Vale, the mountain man who gave her everything. It is a story of loss and hope, fear and courage. But most of all, it is a story of love, the kind that changes everything, the kind that lasts forever, the kind that reminds us that even in the hardest times, beauty can bloom if we are brave enough to reach for it. And so their story ends where it began, in the mountains of Kansas, in a cabin built by strong hands and filled with love, with a family that started with an arrangement and became something infinitely more precious, proof that sometimes the best journeys begin with a single act of kindness and the courage to walk home together, hand in hand, into whatever the future holds.